Esther had a crown, a palace, and a king who loved her, but none of that actually made her safe. When a decree marked her people for death, the very place that looked like favor suddenly became a place where obedience could cost her everything. Sometimes, favor is just an open door that asks you to speak up when it's hardest. Esther found that out the hard way when danger finally reached her palace door. But to really understand that danger, we have to start where Esther started, long before the palace and the crown, back when she had absolutely nothing. Esther's story takes us to the 5th century BC in Persia. At this point, Jewish families were still living far from Judah after the exile. They didn't have a king of their own, and there was certainly no guarantee that anyone around them would protect them. Esther entered this world with almost nothing. Her parents had passed away, so her cousin Mordecai raised her as his own. Her Hebrew name was actually Hadassah, even though the Bible calls her Esther. She was just a Jewish orphan living under foreign rule. Definitely not the kind of person anyone expected to shape her people's future. But the thing is, God doesn't wait for impressive resumes. He tends to work through the people everyone else overlooks. After Queen Vashti lost her position, the king's officials started gathering young women for him. Esther didn't volunteer for this. They simply took her into his household. She didn't know it yet, but being taken was actually the very first step into a purpose she never could have planned for herself. Just think about her walk into that place. Imagine the cold stone under her feet, servants watching her every move, heavy doors closing behind her. Suddenly, total strangers are deciding where she sleeps, what she wears, and when she gets cold. No one there knew Hadassah. The people around her only knew Esther, the young woman brought in for the king. They didn't know the orphan Mordecai raised, or the Jewish girl carrying a secret name from home. She was taken, and keeping that in mind really changes how we read her story. Mordecai had warned Esther not to reveal that she was Jewish. Because of that, she had to live with a hidden part of herself the whole time she was in the palace. She had access, sure, but she didn't have freedom. She had beauty, but that beauty didn't give her any real control. She had status, but as we see later, status didn't mean safety. It's fascinating that God is never explicitly named in the Book of Esther. But that silence, it was actively working the entire time. No dramatic voice from heaven ever interrupts the palace. Instead, a quiet series of choices, delays, losses, and open doors gently pushed Esther toward a moment she never saw coming. When your own road feels confusing, remember that God can work through an upbringing you didn't choose, a place you never sought out, and a role you might not even understand yet. Meanwhile, just outside the palace, danger was already moving. Mordecai refused to bow to Haman, who was the king's high official. We aren't told all the reasons why in that specific scene, but Haman took this one man's refusal as a massive personal insult, and his pride turned cruel incredibly fast. He didn't just want Mordecai punished. Once Haman learned Mordecai was Jewish, he decided that every single Jew in the empire should die along with him. That's exactly how hatred works when it's protected by power. It starts with one person, and then it reaches for a whole group of people. Haman actually convinced King Xerxes to sign a death warrant against the Jews, and messengers immediately carried that order throughout the entire empire. Let that sit for a moment. One man's bruised ego became a literal death sentence for thousands of innocent people. That's the terrifying reality of unchecked pride when there's political power behind it. The day they set for this destruction was the 13th day of Adar. Men, women, and children all faced the exact same horrific threat just because one powerful man couldn't handle being denied honor. The city of Susa sat in total confusion while the king and Haman literally sat down to drink after sending out the decree. One group treated this order like everyday paperwork, while another group suddenly faced extermination. When Mordecai heard the news, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and just cried out in the middle of the city. His grief wasn't quiet, and it definitely wasn't polite. He walked as far as the king's gate, but palace rules strictly banned anyone wearing sackcloth from going past that point. Word eventually reached Esther through her attendants. She found out Mordecai was wearing sackcloth, which deeply troubled her. So she sent out fresh clothes for him to wear, but he refused them. Pay close attention to that moment. Esther's first response wasn't evil or cold at all. She just saw someone she loved in a lot of pain and naturally tried to cover up the visible signs of it. But obviously, a change of clothes couldn't touch the real reason for his grief. A lot of us do that, don't we? We see pain at the gate and we instinctively try to tidy it up. We send comfort or we send kind words. We just try to make the hard thing look a little less hard. Mordecai sent the full story back to Esther through Hattach, one of the king's servants. He gave her a copy of the actual decree and told her she needed to go before the king, plead for mercy, and speak up for her people. At that point, Esther couldn't pretend the crisis lived somewhere else. For a while, her royal position had kept the suffering at a distance. She was safe behind palace walls while Jewish families mourned out in the streets. But God allowed the devastating news to come right to her doorstep. It came through the man who raised her, and through a written order that literally named her own people for death. Maybe that's exactly how a divine assignment begins. It does not always start with a booming voice from the sky. Often it starts with a burden that just keeps reaching you. A need shows up in your office, your home, your church, your school, or even on your phone, and somehow you just can't look away anymore. Esther had a level of access that Mordecai simply didn't have. She could walk into rooms he couldn't enter. Her life sat right near the center of power. But the truth is, access only matters when you use it for someone besides yourself. Still, Mordecai's request only sounded simple if you were standing outside the palace. Go to the king. That one sentence carried a deadly risk that Esther understood better than anyone at the gate. The queen we often picture as totally fearless actually had a very real reason to hesitate. And her next message back to Mordecai would reveal just how dangerous wearing that crown really was. Esther sent a message back to Mordecai, and she didn't sugarcoat the danger. Under Persian law, you couldn't just walk into the king's inner court whenever you felt like it. If the king hadn't explicitly called for you, approaching him could literally result in your execution. Only one thing could spare your life. The king had to extend his golden scepter towards you. That was the brutal law hanging over Esther's head. She also shared something deeply personal with Mordecai. The king hadn't called for her in 30 days. She might have won the title of queen, but she certainly didn't control the king's attention. Having a crown didn't mean she could just knock on his door, step aside, and expect him to be kind. She had absolutely no promise that he would even welcome her, and she had no private, reassuring word from God saying, "You'll be safe." Then, she had to sit with the message she'd just sent. The palace around her might have been quiet, but her own body wouldn't have been. Her mind must have kept looping back to that law, to the inner court, and to the very real possibility that she might not live to see another sunrise. Honestly, fear makes complete sense in that moment. Sometimes, people read the story of Esther as if she just woke up one day, boldly ready to save a nation. But chapter 4 lets us see the real woman. She carefully counted the cost. She knew the law, and she knew that one wrong move could end her life. Her fear doesn't ruin her story at all. Her fear is exactly what shows us what true courage looks like. When Mordecai heard her answer, he didn't soften his response. He bluntly sent word back. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. That sentence must have landed incredibly hard. Esther may have successfully hidden her identity up to that point, but she couldn't separate herself from her people forever. Haman's decree simply didn't leave any room for a private escape. Mordecai was warning her that staying silent wouldn't save her, nor would it save her father's house. The very danger she was hoping to avoid would inevitably find her anyway. Then he spoke the famous words people have been repeating for generations. He told Esther that if she did nothing, relief and deliverance would still rise for the Jews from somewhere else. He completely trusted that this threat wouldn't permanently erase God's people. But noticeably, Mordecai didn't use his faith in God's ultimate plan as an excuse for Esther to just stay quiet. Pay attention right there, because trusting God's overall purpose never gives us permission to ignore the immediate work right in front of us. God can always accomplish what He intends. Esther wasn't some critical missing piece holding His entire plan together. He didn't need her to do this, but He chose her for it. And it still works that way, choosing ordinary people and placing them near the needs He already sees. Then Mordecai posed the big question: who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Who knows? Mordecai didn't give her a solid guarantee, and he definitely didn't give her a full map of how things would play out. He just gave her a profound question. And sometimes, questions can move people who aren't quite sure yet. He was suggesting that maybe the orphanhood, the hidden identity, the palace, and the crown itself had all conspired to bring her to this exact moment. This is huge, because we often want our purpose to feel crystal clear before we step out in obedience. We want the promise in writing, and we want to know the outcome first. Yet, Esther had to move forward with only this one thought: perhaps God had placed her where she was for this very specific need. Esther had to step toward an earthly king, just hoping he would extend a scepter of mercy. But we serve Jesus, who is the greater king. Esther bravely risked her life so others might live, whereas Jesus willingly gave his life so his people could come near to God without any fear. Esther received Mordecai's powerful message, and that pivotal question stayed right in front of her. Would fear decide what happened next, or would obedience? Esther answered Mordecai with a strategic plan, but noticed that it began with total dependence. She told him to gather every single Jew in Susa and fast for her for 3 days, going entirely without food or drink. Esther and her own servants committed to doing the exact same thing. She didn't try to face this nightmare alone. Think about the major shift here. Earlier, Esther was living comfortably, separated from the grief outside the palace. Now, she fully joined herself to a people in their desperate need. The queen of Persia and the Jewish community were carrying the exact same burden, denying themselves the exact same food, and waiting before God together as one. Again, the book never explicitly names God, but this corporate fast speaks volumes. When a group of people has no army, zero political power, and absolutely no safe answers, they humble themselves. Esther didn't make the mistake of confusing her royal title with actual strength. She knew she desperately needed help from beyond the palace walls, and she knew her people needed to stand in solidarity with her. She had 3 agonizing days to wait, 3 long days to consider if she would ever see the sun again. And she knew that when the 3rd morning came, she would have to take a terrifying step that no royal position could protect her from. Then, she finally spoke the words that show us exactly where her heart landed. If I perish, I perish. That is definitely not a speech for someone who thinks she's invincible. Esther didn't boldly claim the king would surely spare her, and she certainly didn't downplay the danger. She simply put the outcome in God's hands, and then chose to do the right thing anyway. When those 3 days were up, Esther put on her royal robes and stepped into the inner court, right where the king could see her. Just imagine the suffocating silence in that moment. She had purposefully crossed the line the law strictly wanted not to cross. Her entire life now rested on a simple movement of the king's hand. King Xerxes looked up and saw Esther, and then he extended the golden scepter towards her. And just like that, the threat of death lifted and she could come near. But surprisingly, Esther didn't immediately expose Haman. That detail really matters. Instead, she invited the king and Haman to a special banquet she had prepared. At that banquet, the king generously asked what she wanted, even offering her up to half of his kingdom. Yet Esther simply asked them both to come back for another banquet the following day. Some people look at that delay and call it weakness, but it wasn't. Esther had stepped forward bravely when she needed to step forward. But she also had the wisdom to know when to wait. Her intense prayer didn't remove her need for practical wisdom, and her strong faith didn't turn her into someone reckless. She deliberately chose the moment. Hard conversations require both courage and wisdom. You have to pray, get your heart steady, know exactly what you're going to say, and then ensure you don't speak out of sheer panic. Esther's faith genuinely had hands and feet. She fasted, she dressed appropriately for the court, she courageously crossed into the inner court, she prepared the banquets, and she carefully brought the right people into the same room. She fully trusted God, but she certainly didn't just sit still waiting for someone else to solve the crisis. While Esther waited patiently through that intervening night, something providential began moving inside the palace, something no banquet guest could possibly see. Ironically, that moment started with Haman's own pride. Haman left that first banquet feeling bigger and more important than ever. The queen had invited only him and the king, which, in his arrogant mind, absolutely proved he held a highly special place in the empire. Yet, on his walk home, he spotted Mordecai at the gate, still flat out refusing to bow. Instantly, all that puffed up pride turned right back into violent rage. Haman's wife and his trusted advisors quickly pushed him toward a brutal answer. They told him to build a wooden pole 50 cubits high, which is roughly 70 feet tall, and then just ask the king first thing in the morning for Mordecai's death. Haman eagerly followed their advice and built the very instrument he thought would permanently end his problem. He had a deadly plan ready for dawn. But that sleepless night in the palace, it literally changed everything. King Xerxes just couldn't sleep. There was no invading army keeping him up, and no urgent messenger bursting into his room. He simply lay awake, tossing and turning, until he finally asked his servants to come read to him from the royal records. As they read, they stumbled across the account of how Mordecai had uncovered an assassination plot against the king years earlier. Xerxes suddenly realized that Mordecai had never actually been honored for saving his life. Haman arrived early that morning to ask for Mordecai's execution, but before he could even get the word out, Xerxes asked him a question: what should be done for the man the king delights to honor? Naturally, Haman completely assumed the king was talking about him, so he gleefully described the exact honor he wanted for himself. He suggested royal robes, riding the king's personal horse, and a grand public parade through the city, with someone walking ahead calling out that this is what happens to the man the king wants to honor. Then, in an incredible twist, Xerxes told Haman to go and do every single part of that for Mordecai. Haman had woken up planning Mordecai's death, and instead, he spent his entire morning publicly announcing Mordecai's immense honor. The man who came to destroy him literally had to march through the streets speaking his worth instead. Haman rushed home in absolute grief and humiliation. But before he could even process what had just happened, the king's servants arrived to whisk him away to Esther's second banquet. At this second banquet, Esther finally spoke plainly. When Xerxes asked her again what she wanted, she directly asked for her own life and for the lives of her people. She bluntly told the king that they had been sold for total destruction. Shocked, the king demanded to know who would ever dare to do such a thing. And Esther pointed right at Haman and named him. There was no more hidden identity, no more silence. She stood before the most powerful man in the world and fully connected herself to the people under threat. Haman's vicious plot hadn't just targeted strangers to Esther. It had unknowingly targeted the queen herself. Xerxes was so furious, he stormed out into the palace garden to process his anger. Haman, now totally desperate for mercy, stayed behind and fell near Esther's couch, frantically begging for his life. Just picture that incredible scene. The very man who had built a 75-foot pole to hang Mordecai was now pathetic, begging for his life near the queen's couch. The exact same queen his decree was trying to destroy. When the king walked back into the room and saw Haman fallen near the queen, his anger simply boiled over. One of the servants casually mentioned the massive pole Haman had just built for Mordecai, and the king gave the immediate order. Haman died that very day on the exact same pole he had prepared for Mordecai. But as satisfying as that sounds, one death didn't legally reverse the decree. The problem wasn't fully solved yet. Because of Persian law, the first decree couldn't just disappear. Instead, Esther and Mordecai had to secure a brand new decree, one that gave the Jews legal permission to aggressively defend themselves when that appointed day of destruction finally arrived. Their massive grief didn't just vanish because someone gave a good speech. Real deliverance came through incredibly hard choices, immense public risk, royal orders, and a wild chain of moments that absolutely nobody could have arranged from the outside. That is exactly why the festival of Purim remembers this story to this day. It remembers the people who deeply mourned, heavily fasted, and faced near destruction, only to live to celebrate their miraculous survival. Again, God's name never actually appears in the Book of Esther. Yet somehow, a Jewish orphan becomes the queen of Persia. A death decree reaches a gate at exactly the right time. A desperate fast gathers a whole people. A king randomly loses sleep. A forgotten historical record gets read aloud. And an arrogant enemy falls perfectly into his own trap. God makes him silent in your life, but he's never absent. You have to watch for the frustrating delays that actually protect you. The ordinary moments that somehow perfectly line up, and the access you never sought out but now desperately need to use. And now, the big question lands right in front of you. Esther didn't ask for the royal position she held, and you might be sitting in a palace you never planned to be either. But the question remains exactly the same today. What are you going to do with the access you have? You may not live behind giant marble walls or sit anywhere near a literal throne, but your workplace, your classroom, your family, your church, your boardroom, or even your group chat might be the exact place where your specific presence carries real weight. Having access isn't always about holding a fancy title. You might just know a deeply hurting person, or you might sit near a crucial decision that affects people who aren't allowed to enter that room. Remember that silence is never truly neutral. When you choose to stay quiet, someone else is forced to carry a heavy burden that you could have helped carry. And that isn't about trying to make you feel guilty. It's simply about recognizing your responsibility. So name one place, name one person. The truth is, God may place you somewhere long before He ever shows you why you are there. And then He might ask you to use that access when it costs you your comfort, your approval, or even your safety. Esther wore a crown, but it didn't make her safe. It made her deeply responsible. Your position might just do the exact same thing. Before this week ends, I want you to look at your calendar and find that one hard conversation you've been actively avoiding, or finally name that specific person who just keeps coming to mind. The real question isn't whether or not God placed you where you are. The question is what you'll actually do now that you know why. Make sure you subscribe, and next week we'll dive into another story where God actively worked without saying a single word. And we'll talk about how to recognize His hand even when everything around you just feels like silence.